people do judge the economy by looking at the Sensex, which has been through a phase of going up and down since the lockdown began. But does
Right.
it give a real impression of the economy? Uh, I mean, can you please give us a brief understanding of the national economic scenario currently in the context of the global economic recession that is ongoing?
Saket, since you ask about parallels from history, let me begin by suggesting and bringing out to your attention two parallels from history that might be useful to us when we are discussing this question about the Indian economy, global recession, and our policy choices. I want to talk of these parallels because they tell us the principles we should follow when we take decisions today. Every decision we take, particularly policy decisions that we make, are on behalf of somebody, and we need to learn in terms of our lessons from the past that we take these decisions on behalf of the majority of citizens and not necessarily on behalf of those who are rich and powerful. So the first parallel, first experience of history that I want to share with you is this experience of cholera in the city of Hamburg, Germany. The lesson that this is about basically the period of 1830 and 1910, and the lesson that this teaches us is that even if cholera has disappeared from our society, the mistakes that the governments made in dealing with it in the 19th century still offer us something to learn, and therefore I want to elaborate on this. So when cholera spread in the city of Hamburg, the powers that be at that point of time decided that once the epidemic had come and it had broken out, nothing could be really done in terms of quarantine or special hospitals or closing of trade and markets, uh, or in any other words, in any other way where greater public health investments were needed. The reason that they could argue that none of this was needed once the cholera and the disease had broken out was because given the existing explanations for cholera, which were, the range of these explanations were from bacterial explanation as a source of cholera to contaminated source of drinking water, to basically infections coming from decaying organic matters, which particularly impacted the poor. The Senate at that point of time in Hamburg was more tilted towards accepting the explanation that prevention and facilitation of hygienic measures towards clean air and rational diet for the poor could have addressed cholera. Therefore, in terms of financing decisions or in terms of decisions of policy that they took, even the doctors at that point of time had no problem when the Senate voted in favor of investing resources in creating in a new town hall, as well as in creating a new port. This was very much in sync with the dominant opinion of the time that it was the poor hygienic conditions of the poor which were responsible for the spread of cholera, and once it had spread, nothing could be done about it. So therefore, the investment could be made in actually further strengthening the trade and the mercantile interest of that point of time. The other decision that the decision makers took in that period was something which is called the Law of November 1896, which was about voting rights. And this law again took again strengthened the voting rights of people, but the voting rights was still truncated in terms of the income level. So the idea was that the decision making at that point of time should be done by those who were at least the better of working classes, or the respectable working classes. So if you can notice that in the voting and it was these voting people who voted took the decision in favor of making investments for the town hall and in favor of making investment to create a new port rather than investing public resources and the resources of the time for strengthening and creation of better public health facilities. So this focus on looking at source of disease by stigmatizing a particular group, in this case the poor, and the government's wavering when it came to taking decisions about the pandemic, wavering between coercion and indifference, and government's reluctance to make investments in public health, to me, it suggests that there are very important lessons to be drawn in terms of parallels from history if we are going to look at how do we respond or what kinds of policy principles we adopt today to deal with a pandemic like COVID. The more detail on this work can be found in Death in Hamburg, Society and Politics in Cholera Years 1830 to 1910 by Richard Evans. Oxford University Press has published this. The second parallel from history that I want to bring to your attention is this whole experience of reconstruction in Gujarat around the recent disaster and particularly the Gujarat earthquake. Now, Edward Simmons' work in 2013, writing on the experience of reconstruction in Gujarat, gives us important insight how to look at reconstruction in a post-disaster situation. The channels of aid and assistance and the external agents in the name of reconstruction dominated the decisions around domestic priorities when it came to the reconstruction phase of the earthquake. So basically the focus of reconstruction was the reconstruction of the physical infrastructure. And the focus of reconstruction was not on livelihood restoration or on gender equality or on public health. So the conditions for loans, the conditions which influence the access of local bodies for infrastructure development in terms of resources to commercial banks, the tax concessions that were put in place at that point of time, the provisions of mandatory insurance that was brought into the rural markets, all brought about fundamental changes in Gujarat. Simpson says that in 2002, the Bhuj earthquake was a watershed in terms of redefining the relationship between the citizen and the state, and it made profound changes to this relationship. The state could no longer be held responsible for the welfare of its citizens. Quite similar to what Naomi Klein argues, that all reconstruction policies are designed in such a way to fundamentally alter the structures of government and society via reconstruction. So the direction of intervention in the form of help, in the form of aid, in terms of development assistance, or were tweaked in a manner that favored policy making in the interest of in the interest of finance and in the interest of big capital, in the interest of profit, and the public disorientation as the disaster in a time of a disaster was used as an opportunity to push this agenda. So we don't need to make these mistakes again. The mistakes that we made in the time of cholera and the mistakes that we made at times of earthquake reconstruction. Because when we discuss recovery and the economic policy choices that we make in the post-COVID world in India, we need to agree, and we need to be conscious of the fact that we need to take policy decisions which are in the interest of the majority of people, that create better conditions for health, better conditions of social protection, and better conditions of work for the large masses of Indian people who are suffering the pandemic of COVID, and we need not carry on with the business as usual to take decisions in favor of the rich and the powerful. Now let me come to the specifics about the question of Indian economy and the policy choices that we could explore to recover from this disaster, and as well as the context of global recession. Now, if we look at the Indian economy before the arrival or before the spread of COVID, clearly there was acknowledgement across all quarters of policymakers, analysts, forecasters and others that the GDP in India had slowed down. In fact, if you look at the GDP in 2018-19, it was 6.8%. In the current year, the estimates are 5% compared to 8.2% in 2016-17. So there was this slowing down of GDP as per the official estimates. And the understanding was that this slowing of GDP was essentially because of the non-government component of GDP. In other words, the fixed investment was slowing down, The private fixed investment was slowing down, real fixed investment was slowing down. In the first 2 quarters of 2019-20, the rate of fixed investment was 4% and 1% compared to 10% in 2018-19 and 9.3% in 2017-18. Similarly, if you look at private consumption, it was muted. Private expenditure grew just by 3% and around 5% in the first half of 1920 and 2019-20 compared to about 8.1% and 7.4% in the previous 2 years. If you look at the exports, which is the other component of GDP, it shows actually negative growth in Q2 of 2019-20. 5.7% in the previous quarter compared to the growth of 12.4% and 4.7% in 2018-19 and 2017-18. So you can clearly see that the non-government components of GDP had slowed down and were very muted. So the global demand was falling. The government consumption expenditure on the other side was the saving grace because it grew at the rate of about 15.6% and 8.8% in the first 2 quarters of the current year, 1920, and 9.2% and 15% in the previous 2 years. So clearly, the government expenditure was the saving grace, was the fulcrum, and was the driver of growth, even though the overall growth had slowed down. Now, even though there was recognition of the slowing down of exports and slackening of global demand, there was at one level acceptance that public expenditures were the source or the driver of growth, but at the same time there was a reluctance to use public investment as a mechanism to bring about growth. And you can find this reluctance at very clearly in, if you read the economic survey, particularly page 59. In the same sentence, there is this acknowledgement that the growth has come about because of public investment, but it also in the same breath talks about fiscal consolidation in the current year for the state governments as well as the national government. So there was this unease because of the orthodoxy of our times, which basically believes that government deficits are bad, a basic premise of neoliberal thinking, and therefore the responsibility for the welfare of the people is not the first responsibility of the state. Governments focus more on output, on efficiency, productivity, those issues, and states focus on social justice, equity, and power to regulate market is consciously eroded as a policy option because of the belief in the neoliberal policy framework. Now, the question that we should be asking today is that has COVID made any difference in terms of our thinking on these issues? Will the post-COVID policy framework be distinctly different from the pre-COVID policy framework? Will we be willing to invest in public health? This is required not only to deal with the specificities of COVID, but also in terms of making public investment as one of the main instruments to bring about growth. So the need of the hour is to come up with a massive fiscal stimulus package, both on health considerations as well as in terms of dealing with the slowing down of demand and not and cash and liquidity not being available in people's hand. Tax collections are going to slow down. The only mechanism that government can kickstart the economy is by putting money in people's hand. Now, this would be the policy choice or the larger principles that should inform policy choice. The specificities and nuts and bolts of this fiscal stimulus can be discussed. The second aspect that you had asked about is about the global recession. Now here again I would like to follow the same approach and ask the question whether the understanding about global recession, how has it changed post-COVID, and are we going to carry on with the business as usual scenario to deal with global recession in the post-COVID world, or are we going to draw some lessons? Now if you look at the discussions on the type of recovery based on different scenarios for COVID, these days actually there is a sort of a lot of talk about using various alphabets to describe the type of recovery. Earlier people used to talk about V, now we are talking about U, W, L, and a tick mark and a Nike swoosh kind of recovery. And each of these are based on different scenarios. How COVID, what will be the time period in which we will need to tackle COVID. V was based on, could be applied, which is most unlikely now, is when the virus clears up very quickly within the month of April or early May. And there is this unleashing of the pent-up demand by a massive fiscal and monetary stimulus that the governments bring about in the developed world. And the economies return to previous levels of output by the start of 2021. This is the most unlikely scenario. Then there is a talk about U-shape. That is, the virus lingers into June, and there is this release of the pent-up demand in part by the stimulus of the governments that is put in place. Also, factories and workers take time to come back to full capacity, and so not until late 2020 or beyond there would be the recovery materializes. The L-shaped scenario is when the virus runs into the second half of the current year, and the debts build up over time. Businesses experience bankruptcies, equity markets fail to bounce, and governments therefore have an increasing role to deliver a far more greater and a deeper stimulus than compared to the previous two scenarios, so as to spark demand. And this would take time to arrange, but only that is the only mechanism where we could then come out of global recession. Another one could be the W shape, where the virus returns, and that would mean reimposing of restrictions, reigniting uncertainty, and forcing the closing of workplaces and service providers. In this case, the result will be a recovery followed by a lurch back into recession, followed by a recovery, and the role of the state and public investment and public resources and cash in people's hand and stimulus would be even greater. If you look at the tick shape, the Nike swoosh, this is a scenario that allows businesses and spending to slowly resume as limits are eased or lockdowns are eased even more carefully than they were introduced. The level of economic output stays beneath the level of the pre-crisis well into 2021. And in this case, the recession is far more prolonged, and therefore the role of public investment and fiscal stimulus, it becomes even larger. So you can see that if you look at these scenarios and the way out, there is one clear message, and the message is that fiscal stimulus would be the key mechanism. And you can see what I take for example of Canada, and see the kind of resources that they're pumping into the economy. The wages for the month of April are already in workers' accounts, even though the month of April has not ended. So that's the extent to which the fiscal stimulus is being pushed, and the government is taking responsibility for the welfare of its people. Now, these scenarios of global recession have to be combined with how global recession was looked at the pre-COVID time by the multilateral agencies, and what was the way out suggested. One clue that I have drawn from is the UNTAD report, which came out in the month of September, and what it talks about is that in order to meet the agenda 2030, and in terms of meeting the MDGs, it proposes that we need to rebuild multilateralism. It talks about a global Green Deal, and also talks about reconsideration and a serious discussion on public financing options for global recovery. It talks about public financing, repairing the social contract, which is more equitable and which is more inclusive and which is more sustainable. It also talks about private financing getting engaged on a more socially productive terms. So you can see that if you look at the options that were available to the world to overcome global recession, even in the pre-COVID world, required reconsideration and a reorientation of the international policy framework. And the post-COVID multiple scenarios that I have talked about, in fact, further builds the point that this public and state-led rebuilding of the global economy, and in our case the rebuilding of the national economy, would really be the only way out for us to recover out of this pandemic with the least damage. Now, therefore, to answer the question that you had asked at the beginning, that would it be appropriate for India and the world to look at the financial markets, and for India to look at the Sensex to take decisions in the post-COVID world? The answer clearly is no. Whether we learn from the lessons of Hamburg and Gujarat, or whether we look at the scenarios through which global recession can be addressed as the multilaterals looked at it before the COVID, and the different scenarios that the forecasters are talking about in the post-COVID world, uh, the only way we can ensure that we don't end up with a scenario in post recovery where the economy may be doing fine but people are not. We need to ensure that the people do fine too, people survive, and livelihood of people are restored, and of course the health consequences of pandemic of COVID are minimized, which all of which requires much greater emphasis on the fiscal side and the fiscal stimulus led by the state, made done through public investment. And this change in understanding about what policy will work in the post-COVID scenario is fundamental for us to find a way out of recession for the Indian economy as well as in the context of the global recession. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for being with us today and enlightening us with your uh, with the with your perspectives on the current situation. And we'll be in contact with you again to probe more realities of our situation currently regarding the economy, regarding our healthcare, regarding the future of our country. And in summation, with what you have said, there is I think it is safe to say that our current system as it stands today has an obvious bias, an obvious class bias, notwithstanding the infrastructure regulations that are in front of us today. And to overcome that, the government has to make a radical departure from not just its policies but of the policies of the previous governments, and towards an understanding of healthcare, of economy for the larger masses rather than for profit, which basically is one of the tenets of capitalism, modern capitalism or neoliberalism as it stands.